First off, congrats on the book.
Thanks very much.
Tell me about your decision to share the story now.
I think it's just an age thing. You get to a certain age and for a start, a lot of the musical references in the book, if I were to talk to, for example, I saw a band a couple days ago in Akron, Ohio, the Delta Saints, amazing band. And I was talking to the drummer and I said, well, where do you come from? Because he wasn't a typical rock drummer. He kind of seemed a bit jazzy. He goes, I was in a gospel group. And I went, wow, the Chambers Brothers. And he didn't know who I meant. And I thought, now the Chambers Brothers, who I refer to in the book, was a kind of a gospel group rock band dressed in cavalry outfits. And their sort of famous thing is they say, my soul has been psychedelicized. Now, I thought everyone in the world knew who the Chambers Brothers were. And I'm talking to a gospel drummer who'd never heard of them. And I think that's kind of what it's about, is a lot of the things, Mitch Ryder and the Detroit Wheels, the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, the bands that were really important to me. It's just been a long time now, so.
You wanted to acknowledge some of those important bands?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
I would say yes. And I also kind of wanted to talk about my original band because I kind of played it down when they died. I didn't make a big fuss out of it and just carried on. And I felt that they deserved more credit than they got.
Well, let's start with the city where you saw this band play, Akron, Ohio, where you grew up. Can you paint me a picture of what it was like as a teenager in Akron, Ohio?
Well, as a teenager, it was all the rubber factories had pretty much closed down for the most part. It wasn't so blue collar anymore. Like all of the northeastern Ohio, Cleveland, Detroit, all of this was going through a transition. It was an automobile culture, and the automobiles had sort of pretty much knocked out a lot of the infrastructure of that culture by putting in interstates, getting rid of public transportation, and the automobile was having, I believe, a very negative impact on the place. And now the factories were closing down, and that's kind of what I grew up with as a teenager. It was becoming a wasteland. The downtown areas were collapsing. And that's what I was responding to.
You were painting a picture that I think a lot of people can relate to, resonated with at that time. You thought it was important to paint that picture socially.
It was really important to me, although most people seemed to be just getting on with their lives and not thinking about it. I had a real acute sense of that I could see the city collapsing. And as a teenager, I wanted to obviously move out of my parents' house and get my own place. But once the downtown's gone, there's nowhere to go. You almost have to leave town. And this really hit me hard. So I wrote about it a lot.
I want to ask you about the music as a teenager. What hit you the most?
Well, of course, I grew up in what I think, if you're a rock fan, was like the greatest time in rock history to grow up in. I was probably 14 when the first Beatles album came out. So, everything I was right there on the spot. I can still remember where I was standing when I saw when someone showed me the first Jimi Hendrix album and, what we talked about. And
where were you?
I was in this guy named Joe Cirillo's house, and my girlfriend said, look at this, it must have been his album. But they made such an impact on me. I can remember when I first picked the albums up, what record store I was in. And also you could reel off the name of 30, 40 amazing bands who were actively working at the time. And every town had its own local band. And bands were the thing, and that's what I grew up with, and that's really what this book was all about, is how much I was in love with that.
How hard was it to describe that level of excitement? I mean, you're talking about the greatest era ever in rock, and being a teenager at that time. How hard was it to describe those feelings?
Well, it's not hard to describe it because once you're thinking about them, you get excited again. But since radio went digital and since radio stopped being... once radio went corporate, I think it's changed again. It was AM, then it went on to FM frequencies and went sort of underground stations, which I talk about a lot. And then when I got my own band together and started doing my own tours of radio stations to talk to people, it had gone very corporate in the 80s, which was a huge disappointment to me. I was crushed by what I saw happening to radio, and I think that's changed again. But the girl who read the book, a friend of mine, Rosanna Arquette, the actress, she's done the talking book. I think that's what it's called. And she said, oh, I didn't know you were such a fan. And I thought, wow, why would anyone get into what I'm doing if you weren't a big fan? But I think once you get in a band and you're out there, you stop displaying what a fan you are because you're on the other side of the fence a little bit or something. Anyway, so I'm really glad that how much of a fan I am and, still am, if that comes across.
It certainly comes across. You talk about your musical education coming from the radio. You take great pride in Cleveland radio and the musical education that brought you. You also talked about seeing bands like the Stones, the Velvet Underground, in small clubs. What was that like?
Amazing. Fantastic. Well, the Velvets I saw I can't remember where I saw them. I think Canned Heat were supposed to play and they canceled, and then it was the Velvets I saw. Alice Cooper was always playing these kind of outdoor, they weren't even festivals yet. They were like amusement parks. The Rolling Stones played at some sort of an arena, I think, in Cleveland. But it was quite elite. Not everyone went because not everyone was into it. It was before it got really big. So
I know it's probably impossible to pick a favorite, but was there anyone who just stood out to you the first time you saw them? You said, I know they're special. Well,
certainly Mitch Wright and the Detroit Wheels, who I saw at a amusement park. They all were pretty special to me. Bowie, when he first played in Cleveland, that was, life-changing. Jackie Wilson, which was a different thing. That wasn't rock and roll, but it was where all of rock and roll came from, was this sort of R&B scene, and he was unique to all that anyway. Any band impressed me.
Any band impressed you at that time?
Pretty much, yeah. And also, they were all great. There weren't really bands out there that were just going through the motions or anything. It was a real ardent scene that was really faithful to the love of rock.
And you had to be committed at that point, too, to get involved, right?
Yeah, there wasn't... Well, with the bands that I grew up loving, they weren't... I don't think people were thinking about making a killing or getting really famous or making... Guys in bands usually started when they were about 15 and then would, get to do gigs around their hometown or, so they're pretty seasoned musicians. You didn't necessarily think there was going to be a record deal involved or that you would ever get to make records. But that wasn't the motivating thing. The motivating thing was to, get in a band.
And you wanted to get in a band. You wanted to be a guitar player. What made you so determined?
Well, I wasn't that determined. I kind of already had given up on the idea. I never thought I was good enough to be really just a player in a band. And then when I got to London and that punk scene was happening, I could see that there was a way that I could be in a band and it wouldn't be a novelty because I was a girl and no one really cared. And actually, no one could play. So that was my way in. I could finally get in a band where, I've been watching these amazing guitar players all my life and aspiring to that. And I was just more of a sort of singer-songwriter. I could put enough together to give a good band something to play.
Do you think that's an important gift of that punk revolution? It gave people an opportunity to play that maybe didn't have rock guitar god chops?
Absolutely. At the time, it had gone, we'd had a lot of great bands starting with the late 60s, and those were sort of garage bands, and before it was called punk. And then, it got more excellent once you got into bands that got to develop their thing with record deals and, Led Zeppelin, whoever it might be, and, all the other greats and, who had real careers that we were looking up to. As far as that punk scene, it was kind of, then it got into prog rock and that got a little bit flabby. It lost a lot of us who were more hardcore fans. And there was a lot of other soft rock around, I suppose. Fleetwood Mac, stuff like that wasn't really doing it for us, real hardcore rockheads. But great bands. But by the time it got to punk, it was a matter of saying, let's forget about all the excellence and just get out there and, go crazy a little bit. And so playing good was actually working against you. You really couldn't be in a punk band if you played very well. So it was like, it was made for me. And that's where I think it helped a lot of people that way. I'm not sure I think stylistically punk has had a bigger impact almost with a look rather than, punk influenced Nirvana.
Yeah.
So it did have a bigger impact than the actual scene that it was at the time.
I want to ask you more about that scene and its evolution, but first I want to stay in your teen years for a little while. You write that becoming a woman was an obstacle, and it horrified you. You describe that in your book, in your teens. How come?
I suppose there's the sexual connotation of having to like start getting into like body functions and things. I was a tomboy, so it wasn't. Yeah, I didn't want to. I liked being a kid. Hence the rock and roll band, trajectory. I mean, that's the one way you can not grow up for the rest of your life. Right. Yeah, I suppose a lot of things, the responsibilities of having to enter into the establishment. Maybe it was all part of that, but, and I like guy things.
Yeah.
I just had boyish tastes, I suppose.
Like what?
Well, I liked bands. I liked, I didn't like sports. Bands. It was always bands. I mean, girls like bands too, but, I kind of really wanted to play guitar in a band.
Was it different at that time? Was that really like a masculine thing, more of a masculine thing, being into bands?
Well, it's not, being a rock guitar player has always been a masculine thing, whether you're a man or a woman. But I think women they've never dominated that very much because either they're going out with the guys in the bands because frankly, those were the coolest guys. So, if you were a cool chick, that's who you wanted to go out with. And then you can't really do it yourself when you're having to look after some moron in a band. You're too busy. And also, traditionally, women, although there have been women throughout history and music, but, they're kind of been tied down by family concerns and that sort of thing. But in the 60s, when the birth control pill hit and everyone could, at the time, it seemed like get freed up from those things, that changed the whole game plan quite a lot. I'm not sure if that worked out so good in the end, but...
It's interesting you describe that as a game changer, the pill and the sexual revolution, that whole social upheaval. And you say you're not sure if that was more liberating. You write that in the book. Yeah,
it seemed liberating at the time, but then it turns you into a slave for the drugs and for the kicks and all the other things, and also, this is a whole other area it's another conversation in a way, but it's certainly the lasting effects of some of this. It's hard to say. I don't think anyone wants to be in a miserable relationship for a long time. But on the other hand, do you want to be in a different relationship every couple of years? Because you get into this like crazy nomadic, not being able to commit to anything. And that spawned a lot of that.
Interesting. You also write openly about the drugs you used. You even write that you don't like how much this story is influenced by drugs.
Well, the whole time I grew up in was totally influenced by drugs. In fact, the characteristic of my generation was that you were either a straight or you were a head. And if you were straight, you weren't one of us. And if you were a head, you smoked pot. And then if you smoked pot, you had to buy it illegally. And if you were buying it illegally, you started being introduced to a lot of other illegal drugs because that's what dealers do. They're trying to make money out of you and, hawk their wares. And then all sorts of bad stuff came into it too. So
but you didn't change that narrative. I thought it was interesting that you said, I don't like how much this story comes down to drugs, but you didn't change it. You said, hey, but that's what it was.
That's what it was. And then the pharmaceutical companies got involved, and that always looks like it's legitimate drugs, and they're still drugs. So when you see how, if you just look at things for what they really are instead of what they're labeled as or what you think they are, tobacco's a drug, alcohol's a drug. This is a drug culture. All those medicines, even if it's blood pressure pills, they're still drugs. So, we're taking a lot of drugs in our culture.
How did it influence your work, that drug culture?
Initially, it probably made me, I was hanging out with a certain type of person, and that influenced it. And I think marijuana, which is probably the best of all the drugs, it's a great enhancer. I'm not talking about the crazy stuff that you can get, but just homegrown marijuana.
What do you mean by enhancer?
Well, it's more of it's almost a medicinal thing. It can be used as a pain reliever. It sort of enhances the mood you're in. If you're listening to music, it can make it enhances the experience. If you're eating donuts, it enhances the experience. It just enhances. If you're depressed, it might enhance that. But it in itself isn't a sinister drug. I think it's the cleanest one of the lot.
Sorry, I got you off track a little bit. We're just talking about how drug culture influenced your work.
Yeah. Well, I think it everyone was. It influenced who you hung out with, where you went, where you spent your time, going to gigs.
Yeah.
And everyone did. It wasn't just me. I
Yeah.
was part of this huge trend. And it's only when I kind of start to notice how many people are dying that I was seeing that, that wasn't such a good idea.
I'm speaking to Chrissie Hynde. Her new memoir is called Reckless, My Life as a Pretender. Reckless. And it seems like you did do some risky stuff in your younger days. How do you feel looking back?
Yeah, well, I didn't feel reckless at the time. It's only when I was writing about it that I thought, wow, I guess it's true. Not everyone else was doing this stuff. I kind of ran with the ball in my own direction. And that's where it took me. And then I noticed that, maybe it seemed reckless by some people's standards. It's all relative.
Is there anything that freaks you out now looking back?
Not really.
So you, in retrospect, you can recognize, wow, that I was a little bit more reckless than I thought. But there's nothing that kind of scares you when you look back now.
Well, I regret a lot of it. I think, we were... it scares me? No, I don't get scared very easily.
You've always been that way?
Pretty much. I mean, I'd rather have the adventure than have nothing. That was always my thing, is it's better to have some kind of experience than no experience.
Where do you think that came from?
I think you're just born the way you are. I think that's just an inherent thing.
I was kind of looking at, obviously, reading your book and thinking, this girl grew up in Ohio and she is full of adventure. I'm just trying to think about, where did this come from?
Yeah.
Did this come from mom or dad or the environment? She's from Akron, Ohio. I don't know.
Well, my brother grew up in exactly the same environment, and he is a musician. He was the musician of the family. He plays sax, and he's been in Kent, Ohio the whole time, and he never wanted to leave. So I really think that this sense of whatever you call it, having to be in a band, having to travel all the time, having to see the world, some people are like that. I don't think it's a good or bad thing. It's just some people do and some people don't.
And it's in you or it's not.
Yeah, definitely.
There's a scene in the book where you talk about taking Quaaludes and getting seriously roughed up by some bikers. What happened there?
Well, I took some Quaaludes and I got seriously roughed up by some bikers. But I mean, anyone who does that and hangs out with those guys, that's what happens. So
you seem to blame yourself in the book.
I didn't
Why?
blame myself. I'm just taking responsibility, And I mean, that happened to a lot of people. Again, nothing that I did or nothing that happened to me was particularly unique or, this is the name of the game. We thought in the late 60s and in the early 70s that these real heavy bikers, that they were just hippies. But see, they were cashing in on that whole drug thing that was going on. They were trying to kind of get the
commerce of that hippie thing. Yeah.
They were cashing in on it. And, we thought they looked cool. So they were the security guards at a lot of rock shows and stuff. At first it seemed like everyone was in it and those guys were part of it. But those guys were actually a criminal element of it. Like so is Charlie Manson.
Yeah.
It was that element that they looked like hippies and they were very attractive to us.
And they were always around, and that's why you seem to fall back in with this crowd a couple of times, and it's because I guess they were always around.
Yeah, they were always around, and especially, if you're taking drugs, that you have to get them illegally, and that's where you find those people. So as long as drugs are illegal, you're going to always be mixing with a criminal element.
You also talk about some good encounters, some better characters that you run into, and you talk about serendipity a little bit. The coincidence.
Well, there's a lot of that features in my story and in my life and probably in everyone's life. But what I've really noticed as I was writing that was that people who didn't really seem that significant, everyone's significant, but in my story, boyfriends and stuff but a lot of them were links for things or things that happened that didn't seem to make much of an impact at the time, spawned, that's how you get through your life, I guess.
Is that something you believe in more now in retrospect?
I just recognize it.
Yeah.
And I certainly have had a lot of that in my, everyone does though. I think you become aware of that. It becomes more apparent in daily life.
Okay, I want to move ahead.
Coincidence.
I want to move ahead in your story a little bit. You're 22. It's 1973. You moved to London, England. What made you want to go there?
Well, I grew up with all those great bands. So I had to be there. And I knew I was going to get out of the States. I didn't want to get into that car culture. I had a real, almost phobia about it. And I have continued to have this obsession with it. I mean, my last Pretenders album was called Break Up the Concrete. I see the concrete came in and pretty much destroyed everything I loved. Yeah, all those vast motorways and everything. I like public transportation. I didn't know it because I didn't have it. I didn't grow up with it, but I knew it was out there and I had to find it.
And when you went there, you felt like you belonged. Some people have an affinity for a place. They go and they realize they should be back home. But you felt like you belonged.
Yeah, as soon as I got there, I was in love with it. I fell in love with it. I really love cities, and I kind of fall in love with them, and I have a real feeling about cities, and that certainly is one of them, maybe the main one.
And you write about the punk scene developing there. You write that you felt it coming in the air. Even before it arrived fully, you could see the aesthetic start to develop. You could see it. What was that like, feeling punk coming?
Well, I think that, sometimes there's transitional periods that people go through in their life and that the culture goes through, and it feels there's a sense of frustration, and you feel like nothing's happening or something feels unsettling. And usually when that feeling is what's happening when you're going through a transition, you can't put your finger on it and there's no evidence of it or anything to prove that it's a transition, but something's about to happen. And I seem to have a pretty acute sense of that. When there's a transition going, you feel very uncomfortable for a while, but you know something's coming. And I could tell that something was coming musically.
And when it arrived, you were in the middle of it. You even worked with Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood. What was that scene like when it arrived?
Well, it was fantastic because everyone was getting in a band. There was no social networking. So if you wanted to get in a band, you had to have your guitar on you and you were walking around going and trying to meet people. And so it was very regional. It was a small scene. And, those are always the best scenes for, any artistic endeavor, when people are face to face and, exchanging ideas and trying to make something happen.
Do you feel that missing now in the era of social networking?
Yeah, totally. I feel it missing. I really, but I think something's coming back. I think we're going to see a shift in cities that collapsed, where it's starting to get more regional and people are moving in and trying to get communities going. And if you can get the infrastructure, this didn't happen here because this has always been a thriving city, but with a lot of cities that collapsed, all the youth population left because they didn't have anywhere to move to when they left home. So I think if people are going to be with the youth culture, there might be a band scene again.
And that's a change you can sort of feel in the air, similarly.
Definitely. I can not only feel that, which I have felt it for quite a few years, but now I can see it happening in cities.
There's a famous story that you almost got married to Johnny Rotten and to Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols.
Yeah,
to stay
nothing
in the
romantic. There wasn't really a romantic scene, and I kind of dig that. It was certainly not like it is. It's gone very conservative. There wasn't dating. I thought we got rid of dating and all that kind of stuff, and high heels and trying to appeal to, this. Seemed very passé. I'm surprised it all came back.
Okay, you were trying to form a band. The book describes many bands that didn't work. Some did work, but you just weren't in them. How did you?
Yeah, a whole lot of them worked, and I wasn't in them.
How did you finally get your band together?
Again, it was I went to Lemmy actually and asked, was sort of moaning to him that nothing was happening for me, and he mentioned this drummer guy, Gas Wild. He said, "Check this guy out if you can find him." So I just saw him on the street one day, and through Lemmy's recommendation, I insisted that we try to do something. And through him, I met the other guys from Hereford. Gas was from Hereford. He didn't last that long. You could say he ran out of gas. And I met Pete Farndon, and then we got James Humney Scott, and then through those guys, we tracked down Martin Chambers.
And it was important to you to be in a band instead of being a solo act. Why?
Oh, yeah.
Why?
Because solo acts are boring. Why would you even want to see a solo act when you can see a band? I never understood that.
Really?
Never.
What about some of the solo acts you saw growing up? Janis Joplin's and...
Okay, well, there's always the exception to the rule. She had a great band, too, the Big Brother and the Holding Company, Iggy Pop and the Stooges. He was my idol. That can work. And when you got someone like Iggy Pop, he's just such a wild card. He's going to have to be off on his own. But for the most part, I really love bands because I'd rather watch, 5 cute guys than one.
And it was important to you not to be marketed as a sex symbol. How did you want to be seen?
Well, we didn't think like that at the time. It wasn't. We have this sort of soft porn culture that really sprang up around the advent of videos, where a lot of people could see that if they just took, stuck their tits out, they were going to get more attention, because sex sells. And then those girls did get a lot of attention. And I mean, Captain Beefheart wasn't making videos. Bob Dylan wasn't making videos. They didn't have to. But, it all kind of, this new trend came in of soft porn. And I didn't, but we all had to make videos at the time for some reason. We just made bad ones.
So it wasn't hard to get people to see your vision of, I want to be in a band and...
No, not if you insist on, if you don't take no for an answer. You can always get what you want.
So you got a band together, the Pretenders, Brass in Pocket, first single, but you didn't want to release it.
It wasn't the first single, actually. We had, it was Stop Your Sobbin' Kid and then Brass in Pocket.
Yeah, sorry.
I wasn't
Kinks
too
cover.
keen on it. I didn't think it really knew what it was.
What do you mean by that?
It was, it's just like that. You do a song and you think, I didn't think it, I didn't know if it, was it trying to be Motown? What was it trying to be? I couldn't figure out.
You didn't have your head around it, and so
I didn't have my head around it when it came out. I didn't really like it very much. Maybe I didn't like the vocal. I don't know.
What do you think about it now?
I don't want to be negative about stuff because I learned if I'm negative about something, then my public will believe me. So if I say that song's rubbish, don't listen to it, they'll be like, well, if she doesn't like it, I'm not going to like it. And like that's kind of going to work against me. So
yeah.
And also there's other people involved in these records. It wasn't just my record. I have to think about the band and the producer too.
But it sounds like you still don't like it.
It's all right.
You write most of your songs alone, and you still seem to be kicking yourself for sharing credit on The Wait.
I'm not. I just wanted to get it out of the way because it did create a sort of and I think it's the significance about that. Well, just to tell the listener, I wrote a song and I gave half the credit away to this guy who I was working with because he insisted, and I thought, it doesn't make any difference. And then I kind of lived to regret that. I'm not particularly bothered about who gets credit for what in general, but that bothered me at the time because I didn't want people to think I wasn't coming up with some good riffs and I'd put in my time, that I was just like the girl singer.
And that was a lot of people's assumption, right? You were singing and writing the lyrics, but it couldn't have been you that was writing the music.
And Pete got all the credit. So, that created a little bit of a ruck. But that kind of thing creates a ruck in bands that's very traditional, where, they mainly it hasn't been a problem for me, but I thought it was significant to include that. It had certain negative ramifications.
You wrote that it's one of the top 2 things that break up bands is sharing songwriting credit.
It can cause hard feelings. A lot of bands start out where they share all the credit because it's one for all and all for one kind of mentality. And then, one guy's going off and writing the songs while the other ones are getting loaded. And, he starts to resent them and certain resentments. The thing is, when you're in a band and there's songs, it can never be completely fair. Someone's added a killer bass line, but they didn't write the song. Then the song does well, and they go, hang on, I wrote that bass line. If the song doesn't go well, they don't say anything. But you never know how this is going to go, and you can't have a killer bass line in a song if there's no song.
Yeah.
So someone has to, even coming up with a title is part of the songwriting because it kicks off the idea. But then you get into, well, hang on a minute, I added 2 notes there. What do I get? But you only start thinking that way if the song's very successful. And then what it's turned into in music is, there are many, many songwriters out there who claim songwriting publishing credit, and they actually didn't write the song. Some of the most famous song acts, biggest acts in the world right now. Or they'll call it tax. We'll do your song, but you have to pay some tax and put our name on the songwriting. So everyone thinks that a lot of women do it. They say that they're trying to control their thing. And actually, it's just cheating. And they say, I won't do the song. You have to give me credit or I won't do it. But, the songwriter will think, well, it's probably better to get, 80% of it.
Yeah.
80% of a million than 100% of nothing.
And there's no resource where fans can go and see who wrote what. It just has the list of songwriters.
Yeah.
Is that right?
And of course now you'll get a list of 8 songwriters on a song because they haven't even met each other, and they put a song writing team on it, which is also very traditional. There used to be songwriting teams and buildings, and they went into work every day and they wrote some of the greatest songs.
Brill Building.
Yeah,
and
of course.
et cetera,
But then when bands came along, it was the bands that wrote songs, and they were writing some amazing. That's the way it went, and now it's always changing. But I'm not. I really don't resent anyone in my career, and I've never been sued, and I've never sued anyone else, and I think I've come out of it, pretty. A lot of people have stories of where they hate everyone else in the band, and they're riding in separate limos, and they don't talk to each other, and I wouldn't even want to work in a band like that. I wouldn't care what the money was or what the prestige or.
The camaraderie is always an important thing.
Oh,
for you.
Of course. Yeah. You have to dig what you're doing on stage, and also it's got too big for my taste. I like theaters and clubs. I don't ever want to go to any bigger than that. I never wanted to.
Why do you think that is? Because that's where you fell in love with the music?
Totally.
Yeah.
And that's where I can see everyone in the audience. In the audience, if I'm in the audience, I can see the band. And I like it to be intimate. I like personal things. So, once you get into big stadiums and stuff, it just becomes like sports to me. I just want to go home. If I'm looking at screens, I think, well, why did I even come out?
What would you say to a young woman today that wants to pick up a guitar and start a band? What would you say to her?
I'd say, yeah, do it.
Just do it.
Yeah. Why not? I can't offer her any better advice than, just don't stop.
I think it's easier nowadays, too, to just start because recording software is cheaper and...
Easy that's a tricky one because what might be easy, comfort doesn't really spawn creativity.
Yeah.
And, if there's a team on it, sometimes it's...
Deadlines, those things help.
There's a lot of things that you don't like that actually help. I mean, I just saw this band the other day. I told you, the Delta Saints. And that's the best band I've seen in 10 years. And I saw them in Akron, Ohio. And, I saw them afterward. There was like 60 people in this club. And I said, so what are you guys doing? They said, well, we just, they get in a van every night, a 6-seater van. They might get into a hotel room, and then some of them will sleep on the floor, and the rest of them sleep in the bed. They're in one room, and they're driving across the country in a 6-seater van. That's the best band I've seen in 10 years. Now, I know I could go out and see a band who all have their own limos and their own coaches, and they're staying in the best hotel, and it's not going to be able to touch these guys. Comfort doesn't breed creativity or... I'm sure these guys
as annoying as that is, it's true.
Yeah, it's always been the case.
Yeah. Finally, I want to ask you about survival. You write in this book about the Bhagavad Gita, for example. You write about once you achieve some success, never looking at your bank account, never looking at press. What were the keys for you for survival? Because a lot of people didn't make it. Yeah,
that's true. Well, my key would be the Bhagavad Gita, and I'd like to have that near me at all times and be able to read that. The Bhagavad Gita is sort of considered the jewel in the crown of Vedic culture, so that's a great thing to have a reference point every day with that. Not getting overly excited about success or failure. Just treading a line in the middle and staying in the middle. That helps.
How hard is that, though?
It's not hard at all,
Really?
It's perfect for someone who's lazy, just don't react. I don't get caught up in things. I don't really celebrate success or failure. If it goes well, fine. If it doesn't, fair enough. But I don't think I have any great survival technique. I think anyone who's made it to the age of 60 has survived something.
But this seemed like a particularly dangerous era. A lot of people didn't make it. You don't think there was a key to your survival? You're one of the lucky ones, or?
I guess luck is I'm not quite sure what that entails. Mm-hmm. I think when things started to feel really starting to take over, whatever it was, a dangerous situation, or I have an ability to try to rein it in a little bit and pull back. Maybe, I don't know.
Well, this was great. Thanks so much for your time, Chrissie.
Pleasure. Always great to be back in TO.
Awesome.